Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Manasa Jagadish, and I'm currently a research assistant at Microsoft Research based in Boston. This particular work draws from a larger body of work that I did during my master's degree at the University of Michigan, so I'm presenting one small slice of it today. And I really want to think about what openness means and how it actually plays out within the broader India Stack project, which is something that exists here in India today. So what is the India Stack? So to introduce it in like a quick way for everyone, India has been championing a third way of creating technology in the public benefit. So this is in contrast to the way the US has done it and the way China has done it, and has repositioned technology as something that can be interoperable and scalable to large populations such as India's, and is explicitly not big tech owned and is often open. So the thing that I'm interested in investigating today is what openness means in this context. Do we mean open source, open data, or open standards? I find that this is often vaguely defined and conveniently invoked depending on the setting. So the India Stack as a technology consists of these three layers that people often talk about. India's very pervasive digital identity system called Aadhaar forms the identity layer. And then if we connect that to a payment system by which people can digitally transact with each other, it's called UPI today, the payments protocol. And then if we tack on a data layer on top of it by which people can share data with government agencies and make that part of data sharing easier, what would that mean? So putting these three layers together, it's been branded and advertised as the India Stack. And this relies on this underlying concept called digital public infrastructure. So this particular idea of DPI is very important for this reason, is that this is currently being packaged and sold to other nations outside India today. And listening around the conversations that are happening at the summit, we can hear that there are lots of talks about India helping other global south countries achieve digital sovereignty. And this has been in the conversation since like G20 times, when India is like trying to position itself as like a leader in this space for other countries from the global south. So before we get into the rest of the talk, here is what I would like you to remember and take away from this particular talk. My main claims are that within this India Stack project, the idea of openness has been used in very vague ways and is often positioned as being in the public interest. But I posit that the word openness might serve other goals in the India Stack context, that of sovereignty and nationalism. And often the people who work on different parts of this India Stack project are operating with a specific cultural understanding of what good means, but this might not always translate into practice. And down the line, this might lead to things that we have to be cautious about, such as open washing. So this idea of national scale digital projects is not new. This has been done by many countries in many different ways. And the idea of governance through technology is something that has existed in many different contexts. So building national scale digital projects such as identity systems, payments, or document managements have been done by different countries in different ways. So consider the US, where digital services are often procured from big tech companies, versus something like China's model of doing it, which is state-owned and state-sponsored. So in contrast, India's way of doing this through digital public infrastructure is not entirely new. And this idea of navigating the tensions between technical aspects of like a system and the actual governance of it have been negotiated multiple times for many different historical technologies. So something like railroads, which came up, were initially something that were built by private companies and then later taken up to be a part of a larger national infrastructure. Similarly for telecom, and then with the actual internet. And this is something that free and open source communities have grappled with for a while. The idea of maybe building technology in the public interest in a certain way. What if we, as a distributed workforce, contributed to technologies and then govern them? So from free and open source communities, this idea of openness and open source has emerged. But the idea of openness in this particular context seems to include all of open source, open standards, and open data, even though they claim very different things technically. Some of the major claims that exist today about open source are that it helps increase transparency and it allows others to control it and not just big tech or the state, and that anyone in theory can contribute and collaborate in these projects. And depending on the setting that you look at, different benefits and downsides of open source have been articulated. So having an open source system allows you to operate separate if any vendor doesn't allow things to get locked in, and it often lowers the cost, and it helps communities engage in software that might not be as expensive as custom-built ones from big technology companies. But in lower resource settings, this might mean that you might not get enough support for your technology project because it's not owned by a bigger company. So this is the setting that I looked at particularly. So I spoke to a lot of people who were involved in the day-to-day workings of the India Stack project. So these were people who were product, program managers, engineers within the broader India Stack ecosystem. There were also people involved in the policy side of things, and many people who interacted with this ecosystem in other ways like research and academia and so on. To contrast this source of information that I was hearing on the ground, I was also interested in the branding and the marketing of this whole project and the larger ambitions behind the India Stack. And for that, I tried to look at press releases and more government work that were used in marketing this India Stack project. So putting these two sources of data together, so these were some of the things I noted. So India Stack emerges from this particular history of free and open source groups that have existed for a while in India. And these groups have a particular framing and understanding of what building technology for the public good means. So many of the people involved within the India Stack were previously private sector engineers who are motivated by particularly mission-driven work and the opportunity to solve population scale problems. So given that context and the people that I spoke to, here's what open source in practice may look like in a lot of these projects. Often, many of these projects don't actually have people working from outside the organization. So the idea of open source is often aspirational, but in practice, it's much harder to implement and might not have panned out so far. And in a range of projects, even though open source was the ambition from the outset, they turn out to be closed by the end of their deployment, and they are not true open source, and often have parts of their implementation which are very proprietary and managed by a very small number of companies. And in many of these other projects, often only API documentation is provided with no access to the source code of these tools. So it is one thing to provide access to the API layer versus seeing what actually gets implemented in practice, which is something you can investigate only through looking at the source code. And finally, this idea of openness is very closely implicated in India's ambitions of exporting these technologies to other global south countries. Often these are sold as open, but large components of these technology, like the biometric systems, are often proprietary and not always spoken about when this technology is being sold to other countries. So finally, I kind of want to tie this together to why this is important for us today. So this idea of one set of promises versus what actually gets played out in practice is not new. This has happened so many times over and over again for so many technologies. And I think we are seeing that play out again, even with AI systems that we are trying to imagine in a particular way, but the ground realities of how this gets implemented are often very different by the time it comes out. And then more specifically within the India Stack project, connecting these many disparate systems into one unified data infrastructure, I feel has primed the whole country to be ready to be the data source on which like an additional AI layer can sit. So this has implications for how our data gets used, managed, repackaged, and sold back to us maybe in the future. So given both those concerns, I think it's worth paying attention to the use of openness within AI systems as we are seeing play out around us today. And I think it's worth remembering and learning from the lessons of technologies that have just come before, and remember that this is not a completely new problem, or even though it is a new technology, we have had precedent from the past before, and it's worth learning from those technologies. Thank you.